Hello and welcome. The Russians are attacking along the front line in Donbas and are actually advancing. And everything, or more and more, is pointing towards a second wave of mobilization within Russia. More in this video. First, let's start with the general situation. The increasing freeze, the decrease in temperature that we have freezing temperatures now within Ukraine is bettering the mobility of wheeled and tracked vehicles by the day. Within a few days, there's probably full mobility restored towards vehicles of war, combat vehicles in the front lines in Ukraine. The British Ministry of Defense is saying the Russians have given up the usage of battalion tactical groups. They have seen that the battalion tactical groups, BTGs, have too few infantry accompanying the heavy equipment, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles. And after heavy losses at the beginning of the war, they tried to fill up the units during the summer, but now have more or less given up and are switching to ad hoc units. So units made up on the spot to achieve what they aim to achieve. This would mean that the whole direction the Russian military has trained and equipped itself over the last years is now basically being put on its head, as they are giving up the whole doctrine, basically throwing it out of the window during the times of war. This would, if this is true, then it should mean a drastic reduction in the combat capabilities of the Russians. As we have said, they have aimed their whole structure towards that system of battalion tactical groups, which would mean that from the officer training, the structure of command, to the equipment, to the training of every individual soldier, it was aimed in this direction. And now, to put it mildly, to put it simply, to summarize it, now nobody really knows what to do, and some of the equipment isn't really made for what they mean to do. The Ukrainian General Staff Deputy Chief Brigadier General Alexei Romov is saying Ukraine has shot down 72% of all 259 cruise missiles and 80% of the 80 Shahed 136 that have been shot towards Ukrainian controlled territory within November. Still, 6 million Ukrainian people, civilians, are now without electricity at the beginning of winter, as the amount of weapons that still cross the Ukrainian air defense systems are enough to create heavy damage, to inflict heavy damage on Ukrainian infrastructure. Still, Russian military bloggers are increasingly concerned about the effectiveness of the Ukrainian air defense systems, and they increasingly are getting doubtful whether it will be possible to achieve the goals in comparison to the efficiency of the Ukrainian air defense system in comparison to the decreasing stockpile within the Russian cruise missile arsenal. Medusa, the Russian opposition media, has said they have received an internal survey from the Kremlin, which the Kremlin itself conducted to know about the war within the populace. And there, the results Medusa is mentioning is that 55% of the Russian population is in favor of peace talks with Ukraine, and only 25 are in favor of a continuation of the war. If this is true, then it would obviously mean that the support for the Kremlin, for the continuation of the war is steadily decreasing, which should at least cause some problems to the Russians in the long term. And from Belarus, we have the usual nonsense. I call it this way because it's what we hear every few days. NATO wants to invade Belarus. Belarus is preparing for war against NATO. Then some saber rattling towards Ukraine from both military as well as the political leadership. All of this more or less to mobilize the Belarusian state, Belarusian people towards war, and more or less to frighten the Ukrainians of a coming Belarusian invasion. But I have not seen any reason to change my understanding and my judgment in this regard, that I think it's extremely unlikely that we will see a Belarusian active participation in the war with its ground troops, as the Belarusian military is absolutely not suited for this, and there might even be loyalty problems among the military when it comes to Lukashenko and his his support for the Russian government. When we're coming about the Eastern Front, well, when we're talking about the Eastern Fronts, the heavy combat is continuing, and the Russians are reporting an increase in Ukrainian offensive activity. That is probably directly related to the drop in temperature, which is now starting to freeze over the countryside and thus end the Rasputitsa and allows Ukrainian mobile forces more mobility. The Russians claim some not completely confirmed successes. They have claimed some successes in Novoselivske and something close to Kremina. I wasn't able to exactly determine the place. We have in Novoselivske, we have video which shows that they are definitely have been there. We see them walking around here, and at least it would indicate that they have reached the border of the town. And they claimed yesterday, I think they claimed that they are in progress of clearing the town, so it might be completely back in Russian hands. But while the Russians have achieved some success, more or less certain, in Novoselivske, the Ukrainians have achieved some success in Chervonopopivka. From the Russian side, we have reports that the Ukrainians have reached the outskirts of Chervonopopivka. As we can see, this is directly next to the, I think it's P66. I always forget if it's R66 or P66. So basically the road between Kremina and Svatove, and thus one of the most important lines of communication among the Russian front line here. And as you have seen, the outskirts of Chervonopopivka are just 1 kilometer away. At least according to this map, they are more or less 1 kilometer away from the road. So it's now in direct striking distance, except of course, the map here is not completely accurate, and this is seen more or less as the outskirts, but even then it would be 2 kilometers more or less, or maybe a little more than a mile to my American audience. So the Ukrainians are advancing here and are trying to push towards the road. I have no confirmation yet, though, that they have actually reached it, which would be a big help to the Ukrainians and should allow them to push in the front line at other places as well. Further south of the Siversky Donetsk, the situation is somewhat different. We have massive attacks by the Russians like they have happened in the past few months. Along the whole front line, the Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming that they have captured Bilohorivka. Some other claims said that in the western part of the town there is fighting happening. So that would indicate that they have thrown out the Ukrainians more or less of the whole town, which part you want to believe. I have not seen visual proof yet, so Bilohorivka is likely still contested. At least we should consider it as this. Spirne is under heavy assault. There have also been claims that it's already been captured, but in other, like I think Kadyrov was among them, who said that it has been captured, but it seems unlikely at this very point that they have already been successful. We have pictures and videos of heavy fighting around Bakhmutske, which is directly northeast of Bakhmut itself. It's highly important because it is the access to Soledar, which is along the line of communication northwards towards Siversk, so which connects Bakhmut and more or less the whole front line here and gives it an easy access. So holding Soledar is extremely important for the Ukrainians. There is heavy fighting here. I cannot confirm that the Russians actually achieved anything here, but south of Bakhmut, they have achieved some notable success. We have reports from the Ukrainian side that they actually have given up parts of Opytne, that they retreated from parts of it. It seems to be still contested to some degree, but it would mean that the Russians achieved some local successes here. Further south, the successes are significantly bigger, though. The Russians have taken, and that's confirmed, Andrivka, Kurdiumivka, and Ozaryanivka, which are those more or less around that line here. And there's unconfirmed reports about fighting at the outskirts of Kirshivka here. This would obviously be a serious threat to the Ukrainians, as while they may still have a ridge line in between them, it would mean that the Russians are pushing towards the important line of communication from the west towards Bakhmut. They have, by the way, there have also been some reports that the Russians have already reached Khasif Yar, but I don't see any proof whatsoever of this. This was just some nonsense from the Russian Telegram sphere. At least I see the high probability of this. So the Russians are advancing here, which is not insignificant. They are pushing further east, and should they threaten this road, should they actually capture it, it might come close to forcing the Ukrainians to retreat from Bakhmut, as obviously they still have a way out towards the north. But the threat of being encircled, the Ukrainians will not take that risk if they have to avoid it, if they can avoid it, as Bakhmut is not worth losing men being encircled and then destroyed there over time. So while the Russians are advancing here, we have reports about how those advances are going on. Supposedly, they are under extremely high casualty rates. The Russians are just pushing troops in more and more to make those gains here. Whether it'll be worth it will be a question for the future, though. Further south, we have the usual reports about fighting around Avdiivka. I have not seen any proven successes by the Russian here. There are some claims that they advanced somewhat in Nevelske, that they advanced towards Pervomaiske, that they have advanced in Vodiane, but I don't see any proof of this whatsoever. So the fighting is continuing here, but I cannot confirm massive successes from them here. We have a report from the Russians are also claiming that in Marinka they now control 2/3 of it, so that they have advanced here over the last day. There was a CNN interview, and I've kind of forgotten this, about Bakhmut, where they talked to a Ukrainian officer, and he said his troops around Bakhmut are massively outnumbered. And he's also saying that they have supply issues. So the supply that is coming in is increasingly being reduced. They don't receive enough support there. South of the whole area, we have reports about Ukrainian attacks from Bodiane and from Novomykhailivka towards the east and southeast. So along this area, I have reports about Ukrainian counterattacks, but I cannot confirm that they have achieved anything whatsoever. Towards the southern front, we have reports that the Russians are withdrawing troops from the front line in Zaporizhzhia, which is kind of surprising, as we would expect the troops here to engage each other fairly soon in the next possible offensive. But supposedly the Russians are pulling troops back, which can be interpreted that the threat by Ukrainian artillery is being so big that they thin out their lines in the front, not with the intention to hold the Ukrainians on the front line itself in case they are attacking, but more to just slow them down and have the majority of their forces further back to actually stop them there, which would also allow them some forewarning and thus give away some part of the element of surprise for the Ukrainians in case of an attack here. Along the whole front line in Kherson, we now have reports about, along the rest of Oblast Kherson, we now have reports about Russian reinforcements, Russian fortifications, not reinforcements, entrenchments, defensive structures being built. That actually shows that and a lot of it is actually aimed towards the west. So towards the Dnieper. This shows that the Russians are actually taking it serious, that the Ukrainians might cross the river and push towards the east. I still believe it's highly unlikely, as it would be an extremely risky undertaking, which at most might be in conjunction with a breakthrough close to Melitopol. So not by itself, only if big success has been achieved already in the east. But at least we see that the Russians are actually preparing for it. And we have reports about fortifications more or less along the whole area here. So this is an indication that the Russians are preparing a defense in depth and to allow themselves to slow down sudden, unexpected Ukrainian breakthroughs, as they have prepared positions more or less along any line of communication southwards towards Crimea, towards the Crimea. We have pictures from the Russian positions at Nova Kakhovka. We see them here. This is the dam and this is the Ukrainian held site. So we see Russian forces being here. Interesting too that apparently from the Ukrainian side there is no big threat of snipers here yet. When we see those, at least that would be the expectation. The machine gun position is fairly high too, so the soldiers should be more or less exposed. We have images here of the situation of the locks itself, of the fortifications, and we see Russian soldiers here in preparation to defend the crossing. And here we even see a automatic grenade launcher that would be used to stop any potential Ukrainian advance. We have more pictures here, and it's claimed that they are terrorists because they use this for shelling. And if it's actually on the grounds of the hydroelectric plant, which I can't fully confirm here, then it would probably be legally a usage of critical infrastructure for the civilians for military purposes, which in this case should likely be considered a war crime in actuality. We have, other than that, we have reports from the Kinburn spit. There have been rumors and talks about military activities there over time. You find some people claiming on Twitter for 2 weeks now that basically Kinburn Spit is already liberated. We now have new reports from the Ukrainian side. They confirm that there have been activities, but this time they explicitly said no settlement has been liberated. So what we see here is not an attempt to create a bridgehead. It confirms my initial guesses in this regard. It confirms that there's no attempt to set up a bridgehead, which wouldn't make sense according to the whole geography here, but it's rather a activity probably with special forces trying to destroy listening posts, observation posts, create some maybe positions for the control of the Shahed 136, something like this in this regard. HIMARS, just so I mention it, is still active along the whole front line. In the south, we have reports of Ukrainian attacks, but also in Donbas itself. And we have reports, obviously, that the Russians are striking back themselves too, with Shahed 136, with cruise missiles, but also with long-range artillery, long-range rocket artillery, and with S-300 from Ochchakiv. We have reports over to Mykolaiv, to Dnipro and Zaporizhia of being attacked. So more or less along the whole front line, the Russians are still trying to attack things. When it comes to partisans, we have a IED reported in Mariupol, but without any victims in this regard. So nobody was injured with this. And finally, we have more information about the mobilization. Here we have the actually must have missed it. No, military blogger Slatkov. Exactly, I wasn't able to translate it. Slatkov, he is Slatkov Plus. It is a big Russian Telegram channel, and he has over 1 million readers, so it's one of the big Russian pro-Russian military channels. And he says Russia should switch to World War II artillery and should create cheaper, simpler to produce weapons to win this war. He's saying that NATO is increasingly having material shortcomings, so the amount of weapons it will be able to continue sending to Ukraine will be reduced, and with a big number of simple weapons in the hands of mobilized soldiers, Russia will be able to overwhelm the Ukrainians. So basically he's asking for a mass mobilization and cannon fodder to simply overrun the Ukrainian positions. But we also have more and more signs of a second wave of mobilization that is coming in certain areas. We have reports that men have been asked to certify their military data, to actualize it, to update it more or less, to make sure that the official positions, official offices have everything in order. And there have been reports that after that they were ordered that they are no longer allowed to leave the country after they have been registered. All of this obviously would point in the direction of a second wave of mobilization. The opposition platform Medusa again is saying in Sverdlovsk there were 250 prisoners now that were sentenced to forced labor. They are now being used in a tank factory. So the Russians are switching to forced labor to keep their defense industry going. That factory supposedly repairs but also builds new armored fighting vehicles. In this regard, now being done with forced labor. And in that factory, Medusa is reporting that the regular workers already have to work up to 4 hours additionally on every workday. And they also have to do weekend shifts on top of it to increase the production. The Russian Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, we heard about her a couple of times before, is now initiating and asking for a law that would make it easier to hire people below 18 to address the labor shortage, which then is another sign of how the mobilization and the loss of people that left the country is already causing serious problems in the Russian labor market. Other than that, tons of reports from various places that Russian soldiers are still not getting paid, are only getting paid a fraction, and some have not received a single ruble for their time on service. So all of this is not pointing in a good direction. And here we have some reports, just an example here from a Telegram site that in the Tomsk region, a father is complaining that his son was killed within a month and he was used like cannon fodder. That behind them there were blocking detachments, so he would have been shot if he had retreated. And he said that that no one trained his son together with his colleagues. They were simply sent to the front line. Now, obviously, I can't confirm that if this is completely true, but we have increasing reports about this, and we need to see this under a different light. We are no longer in the times of the Tsar and of Stalin, where killing your own countrymen in big bulk might be somewhat possible without repercussions. We now have an information age where even with strict controls by the Russian government, people can still voice their opinion if they are angry enough and are willing to take the problems that might come to it. And obviously the big issue here, which is massively different from past wars, is that the Russian demographics is an absolute catastrophe. So this guy who was killed was likely the only son of the father that is currently complaining, unlike in the past where he might have been one out of 5 sons, and thus much more, which makes it much more easy for parents to actually accept the loss in service of the fatherland. But now, if you throw away human lives, if you use them in human wave attacks as cannon fodder, this should over time have some repercussions for the Kremlin by causing massive dissent within Russia. From the political sphere, we have more reports about children being transported to Russia. We talked about this extensively in the past, that the Russians call it evacuation, vacation, medical leave, whatever you might call it. They give it many euphemistic words. The Ukrainian side is saying these are deportations, and a lot of the children are either then adopted by Russian families to assimilate them, or they will be kept in Russia to force the Ukrainian parents to follow their children deep into Russia, and then without an option to go back, basically force them to assimilate within the Russian population. A direct answer to the catastrophic demographics within Russia. When it comes to international support, we have reports here. I actually missed that one. It's not good, but I have it here. We have reports here about from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Zambia that are saying a Zambian student that was in Russia for university has been killed in the front lines in Ukraine and in the Ukraine war. He fought within Wagner, and Prigozhin has already praised him and claimed that this student wanted to thank Wagner for saving the lives of millions of Africans with their activities within the African continent. But the interesting part is also that where was it? He was 23 years old, engineering student, but he was sentenced, 9 years and 6 months of imprisonment. Unfortunately, I can't find what he was sentenced for. So it's a sign that of one of the convicts. Wagner doesn't just recruit convicts that are Russian, but also foreigners. But as far as I know, this is the first confirmed Wagner mercenary that has died within Ukraine that actually was not from Europe or even from Russia. It was the first African one. I have not heard about a single one before. So you might have had. If you have so, then please post the information in the comment section so all of us can find it. But this is a sign of the international, if you want to call it like this, support for the Russian war effort here. When it comes to actual support, though, we have this here. This is from the Czech Republic, and it's supposed to be the modernization of T-72 within Czech tank factories. We see a rusty old Hulk here that has been obviously is not in fighting condition here, and that's supposed to be one of those new ones that is being modernized with on the bill of the Dutch and the Americans. You remember that they have made an agreement with the Czech Republic to pay for the modernization and refurbishment of T-72 to then give it to Ukraine. I think it was 90, like it said here, and it's supposed to not just make it running again, but also give it thermal vision. I think this here should be the thermal optics, and we have this here, a gunner sight, which might be thermal optics. I'm not completely sure, but what he means with dynamic protection, I would expect an active protection system, and I have to say I don't see any yet. That seems to be regular contact 1, even though I'm not completely sure. So at least the tank is getting back in working order, even though it might be a little less modernized than you might think at the first point, especially if this is actually contact 1. But obviously thermal vision, if it's true that commander and gunner both get thermal vision, would be a massive improvement, because in the end, the most important part is who identifies the other tank first and then who shoots first, because that is usually the one who also hits first, and whoever hits first is usually the one who wins the engagement. So thermal vision is of extreme importance, much higher than probably anything else that could be done to a T-72M or A, whatever that one is. But here we have the images of the modernization and repair work that is being done on them. You can see in the different pictures, and this is supposedly what it's coming from. We see two rusty hulks here that are being extensively modernized and repaired for the use in the Ukrainian armed forces. I also have some information from CNN. According to them, Biden and thus the US are considering to massively expand the training for Ukrainian soldiers. And the talk is here now about 2,500 Ukrainian soldiers per month in a US base in Germany. So that probably Grafenwöhr, but I'm not completely sure. So the training of the Ukrainian armed forces is supposed to increase by a huge part. I think Germany wants to train 5,000 or 6,000 in total. With their latest commitment in this regard, the US would train half of that per month. Also, we have an interesting picture here, Bashkir volunteers fighting along the Ukrainian troops. The thing is, though, we can only see that sign on 2. That might be another one among them. And the interesting part was obviously, what is Bashkir? I didn't know, you probably don't know either. So I Googled it. Bashkirs are a Turkic people that live in Russia. They are an ethnic minority. In total, they have 1.1 million that are in their main region. And they published a letter on a small Telegram channel that seems to be theirs. It said here currently 138 followers. It probably has a little more now. Yeah, it's roughly 700 now, but they claim that this is translated more or less that they've seen what Russia does within Ukraine. You can pause the video if you want to read it by yourself. They more or less have seen what Russia is doing within Ukraine, and now they're going to fight for their liberation as well, which would then be an indication. If this is true, it could be propaganda as well. We obviously need to acknowledge this, but if this is true, this would be a sign of a separatist group that might be starting its activity now. One thing I mentioned here on the channel with the extreme focus on ethnic minorities in part of the mobilization, that this is a high risk for Russia in the future, that by focusing on ethnic minorities, they basically give them a reason not just to no longer be loyal, but to actually start a separatist movement if they feel like they are being used as a cannon fodder to save the lives of ethnic Russians. This might be a sign of this actually happening now, but as said, it's a little early to confirm it as of now. Then another information I found, there's a never before seen malware is nuking data in Russia's courts and mayor's office. It says it's masquerading as a ransomware, but it's actually destroying data on a big scale. So it's likely some kind of hacker attack against the Russians. Whoever is the reason for that, I can obviously not say. And finally, the last thing I have is from the Russians themselves, Kommersant, and that's an interesting thing because they say that China is refusing it's translated with Google Translate, so the original is in Russian, that China is refusing Russian insurance documents. Now, this is not completely clear what that will mean in the end, but the theory would mean that Russian ships that have been refused insurance from the West, which they have, that they should no longer be allowed to enter Chinese ports, which would obviously be a really big deal when it comes to the trade between those nations. I have no idea what solution Russia and China might figure out. China might just force Russia to insure it with Chinese companies and thus even make more profit out of the whole deal. So the trade might go more or less unhindered, just with more money transfer from Russia into China. But it shows here, we can take it as some example that the hyped alliance between Russia and China is not in actuality such an alliance as some people might want us to believe it. That's it from me for now. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you like to support the channel, I'd really appreciate it. If you want to, you can do so by the links in the description. Thank you so much to everyone who already supported the channel. Other than that, you can obviously also help the channel by hitting the like button, leaving comments. What do you think? Is it worth what the Russians are doing in the Donbas? That's a big thing, because if you see the small advances, that would be probably worth a discussion. And would you be interested in me making some video about the B-21 radar that was unveiled yesterday night? I'm looking forward to your comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and if you want to help the channel grow, please share and to friends in the channel and this video to friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.